If you hold enough XLM to be in the top 1% of all holders, that actually means something specific, measurable, verifiable. And I'm going to show you the real number cross-referenced against XRP and HBAR2, because comparing the three side by side too actually tells you something interesting about how differently these three networks are structured underneath. Let's get into it. Let's start with XRP, since it's the clearest, most well-documented data set of the three, and it actually gives us a really useful reference point for understanding the other two. On the XRP ledger, the top 10% threshold sits somewhere around 2,200 to 2,486 XRP. At recent prices, that's somewhere around $3,200 to $3,600. A position a lot of regular retail investors could realistically build toward over time. The top 5% threshold jumps to somewhere between 7,745 and 8,000 XRP. And the top 1%, the real elite tier, requires holding at least 46,323 XRP. Look at that gap for a second. The difference between the top 10% and the top 1% is roughly a 20 times jump. That's not a small step up. That's an entirely different category of holder. And if you go even further, the top 0.01%, the absolute top of the pyramid, requires over 3.83 million XRP. And there are only around 663 wallets in the entire world that clear that bar. Mostly exchanges, Ripple-linked addresses, and a small handful of early insiders. Let me put real dollar figures on that curve, because I think seeing it laid out actually makes the jump plan. At 46,332 XRP, the top 1% threshold, you're looking at somewhere around $55,000 to $65,000, depending on the exact day's price. At 3.83 million XRP, the top 0.01% threshold, that same math puts you somewhere north of $4.5 million. So between the top 1% and the top 0.01%, you're talking about roughly an 80 times jump in required holdings. That's the kind of curve you'd expect from a mature, well-documented asset with a long institutional history sitting at the very top of it. A gentle, gradual rise through retail and into genuine wealth, followed by an almost vertical wall right before you reach the tiny cluster of exchanges and company-linked wallets at the absolute summit. Now let's get to XLM, since that's actually the main focus here. XLM's rich list data is structured a little differently than XRP's clean percentile table, but there's still real useful information sitting in it. Here's a genuinely striking data point to start with. About 90% of all XLM holders own less than 100 XLM. 90% at current prices. Around 20 cents, that's less than $20 worth of XLM for the bottom 90% of all wallets on the entire network. That tells you something important right away. The gap between average holder and anything resembling an elite tier on Stellar specifically is enormous, because the baseline for the bottom 90% is genuinely tiny. So what does that actually mean for where the top 1% line sits? If 90% of wallets hold under 100 XLM, then by definition, the entire top 10% of holders sits somewhere above that 100 XLM line. And the gap between the top 10% and the genuine top 1% following the same kind of steep curve we just saw in XRP would put you somewhere into the thousands of XLM territory, possibly low tens of thousands, depending on how steep that particular curve is. I don't have an exact, precisely published number to hand you the way I do for XRP, and I think it's more honest to tell you that than to just make one up. What I can tell you from the broader whale tier breakdown that's actually published is that the next meaningful tier up from ordinary retail, the genuine whale category, individual large holders, generally sits somewhere between 1 million and 10 million XLM. Below that tier sit wallets holding somewhere between $100,000 and $1 million. And below that sit holders with tens of thousands of coins. So if $100,000 to a few hundred XLM is your typical retail wallet and individual whale territory starts around $1 million, the genuine top 1% of all holders is very likely sitting somewhere in the tens of thousands to low hundreds of thousands range. A real meaningful step up from the typical retail wallet, even if it's nowhere near close to the million-plus whale tier. And I think it's worth being clear about why the very top of XLM's rich list looks so different from a typical elite individual investor tier. The single biggest wallet on the entire network holds about 41% of total supply. And that's not a person. That's the Stellar Development Foundation, the nonprofit that stewards the network, holding funds earmarked for ecosystem development and grants. The top 10 wallets combined control somewhere around 50% of total supply, which works out to close to 80% of circulating supply. Specifically, below that top 10, roughly 37% of total supply sits in wallets ranked 11 through 100, and the top 100 combined control around 87%. So the elite tier conversation on Stellar specifically has a strange shape to it. It's not really a smooth, gradual curve from retail up to billionaire. It's more like a cliff at the very top. Foundation and exchange wallets holding enormous chunks, and then a much more gradual, much more normal curve underneath that for everybody else. Trying to climb from 100 XLM up toward genuine whale territory. There's also some genuinely encouraging context sitting underneath that concentrated top tier. Worth mentioning before we move to HBAR, Stellar's active account count has been growing fast from around 7.2 million accounts back in 2023 to roughly 9.5 million by the middle of last year, adding something like 5,000 new wallet addresses on that average every day. That's a real ongoing expansion of the retail base, sitting underneath all that concentration at the top. Which means even though the top 1% threshold is hard to pin down with the same precision as XRPs, the overall pool of people you'd be competing against for that tier has been growing steadily, not shrinking, which actually makes climbing into a genuinely elite tier a moving target in a way that's worth being aware of if you're planning to plan around it. Now, HBAR. And here's where I really want to be honest about the data gap, because I think pretending otherwise would actually undercut the whole point of this video. HBAR currently trades somewhere around 9 cents. A wallet holding 1,000 HBAR is worth somewhere around $87. 10,000 HBAR sits around $870. 20,000 HBR reaches somewhere around $1,740. Those are real useful reference points, but they're price tier reference points, not percentile of holders reference points. And that's an important distinction I want to keep clean here. What I can tell you about HBAR's actual concentration structure is this. The single largest known whale wallet on the network holds somewhere around 3 billion HBR, which against a $50 billion total supply works out to about 6%. 6% in the single biggest wallet I could find solid data on. Compare that to XLM's 41% single wallet, or even to XRP's 6 escrow wallets, each holding 5% apiece. HBAR's biggest known holder controls a meaningfully smaller slice than either of the other two coins' biggest single wallets. There's also some community speculation that even that biggest HBAR wallet might actually be tied to an exchange, meaning pooled customer deposits rather than one entity's personal stash, though I don't have full confirmation of that either way. Broader whale tier concentration on HBAR, a wider band of large addresses rather than one precise top 1% line, has been estimated somewhere around 50-55% of total supply. That's a real number. It just covers a much broader, fuzzier category than the precise XRP percentile table does. So if you're trying to figure out exactly how much HBAR puts you in some specific top 1% tier, the honest answer is that exact figure isn't published anywhere I could verify with confidence, and any video that hands you a suspiciously precise number for HBAR specifically is probably guessing dressed up as data. I do think it's worth noting that HBAR's staking participation rate gives us at least one useful, real comparable data point, even if it's not a percentile threshold in the same sense that XRP's data does. Right now, roughly 29% of total HBAR supply is actively staked across the network, which means a meaningful chunk of the supply is in the hands of holders engaged enough to actually delegate their tokens to a node and collect ongoing rewards, rather than just sitting passively in an exchange account. That's a different lens on who's serious about this asset than a pure wealth percentile, and it's one HBAR can actually offer that's arguably more interesting even if it doesn't translate directly into a coin. Count threshold the way XRP's data does, so here's the actually interesting comparative insight sitting underneath all three of these data sets, and I think this is the part that makes cross-referencing them worthwhile. Instead of just listing three sets of numbers in isolation, XRP has the cleanest, steepest, most precisely documented percentile curve of the three. The jump from top 10% to top 1% is roughly 20 times. That steepness happens partly because XRP has such a long, well-established trading history with deep, well-tracked exchange wallets and a clearly documented corporate escrow structure sitting at the very top, giving analysts a clean dataset to build precise tier thresholds from. XLM's curve is messier to pin down precisely, but the shape of it actually is the most extreme of the three at the very top specifically, because of that single mega wallet sitting almost alone at the summit. Once you get below that one mega wallet though, the curve underneath, from genuine whale territory down through retail, looks structurally similar to what you'd expect on any maturing network, individual whales in the millions, a broader mid-tier in the hundreds of thousands, and a long tail of small retail wallets. HBAR structure is the flattest of the three at the very top. No single wallet anywhere near the size of XRP's escrow wallets or XLM's foundation wallets, but it's also the least precisely documented overall, which itself tells you something. The rich list tooling and percentile tracking culture around HBAR specifically just hasn't matured to the same level as it has for XRP or even XLM yet, even though the underlying network itself, throughput, finality, enterprise positioning is genuinely sophisticated. I think there's actually a pretty reasonable explanation for why HBAR's tracking culture lags the other two, beyond just being a newer asset. XRP and XLM have both had a long-running, very vocal retail community built specifically around price speculation and rich list comparisons for years. The kind of community that produces dozens of independent rich list trackers and percentile calculators precisely because so many holders are obsessively checking where they personally rank. HBAR's holder base has skewed more toward people interested in the enterprise and institutional side of the story, specifically the partnerships, the throughput numbers, the regulatory positioning, which means there's simply been less organic demand for the kind of granular, gamified percentile tooling that XRP and XLM built out over time. That's not a knock on HBAR's fundamentals at all. It's just a difference in what kind of holder base each network has historically attracted, and it shows up clearly the moment you go looking for this exact kind of data. Now, why does any of this actually matter beyond just being a fun where do I rank exercise? I think there are two real reasons. First, knowing where you actually sit gives you an honest, calibrated sense of what elite really means in dollar terms for each of these coins, instead of an inflated mental picture built from social media, flexing on XRP, the real top 1% threshold, $46,323 XRP. At recent prices works out to somewhere in the range of $50,000 to $65,000, depending on exactly where the price sits when you're watching this. That's a meaningful position, genuinely above what most casual retail holders carry. But it's not some unreachable billionaire-only tier. It's the kind of number a disciplined saver could realistically build toward over a period of years. On XLM, given the steep drop-off at the very top is mostly foundation and exchange wallets. A more realistic, achievable elite among actual individual humans target sits in that tens of thousands of coins range I mentioned earlier, which at current prices is a few $1,000s. Genuinely achievable for a lot of people with consistent saving second. And I think this is honestly the more useful takeaway. Understanding why each coin's top tier looks the way it does tells you something real about the underlying networks, maturity, and structure, not just about your own portfolio size. XRP's steep, well-documented curve reflects a coin with a long trading history and a transparent, scheduled corporate escrow. XLM's lone mega wallet at the very top reflects a foundation-governed network where O Processtem Marcos funding sits in one transparent, mission-aligned bucket rather than being spread across many private whales. HBAR's flatter, less precisely tracked structure reflects a newer, rich culture around a network and it's been growing its enterprise and institutional case quickly, sometimes faster than the analytics tooling tracking individual holder behavior has caught up to. None of these three structures is objectively better or worse than the others. They're just different. And understanding the difference helps you read headlines about concentration risk with way more nuance than a single scary percentage ever could on its own. A 90% of supply held by whales headline means something completely different depending on whether you're talking about Ripple's scheduled transparent escrow, the Stellar Foundation's mission-funded treasury, or a more diffuse, less tracked whale tier spread across many independent holders. If you actually want to go check where you personally sit on any of these three rich lists, the tools are free and public. XRP Scan and BitHomp for XRP, Stellar Expert for XLM, and various Hedera-focused explorers for HBR. Even if that last one's percentile breakdowns are less precisely published than the other two. You don't need anybody's permission or any special account, just your wallet address and a few minutes. So here's the honest summary. If you're holding 46,000 XRP, you're genuinely in the top 1% of that network's holders. Verified, documented, real. If you're holding somewhere in the tens of thousands of XLM, you're very likely sitting in a comparably exclusive tier on Stellar, even though I can't hand you as precise a number as I can for XRP. And if you're holding a meaningful HBAR position, the honest answer is the data to tell you exactly where that places you percentile-wise, simply isn't mature yet, even though the network underneath it has been moving fast in other ways. What actually matters more than the specific tier you land in is understanding the structure behind each number, because that structure tells you whether the concentration above you is a sleeping risk, a transparent, predictable mechanism, or just an under-tracked, evolving picture that's still catching up to the network's actual growth. And I think there's a broader lesson here too, one that applies well beyond just these three coins specifically. Anytime you see a top 1% or top 0.1% claim thrown around for any cryptocurrency, the actual quality and source of that number varies enormously depending on how mature and well-tracked that particular network's holder base happens to be. A precise sounding number isn't automatically a trustworthy one, and a vaguer, more honest range isn't automatically a sign that nobody's done their homework. Sometimes it's the more accurate reflection of what's actually knowable. Learning to tell the difference between real, sourced precision and confidently stated guesswork is honestly a more valuable skill for navigating this entire space than memorizing any single coin's specific threshold number, because that skill travels with you to literally any asset you ever look into. Not just the three we covered today. If walking through the actual verifiable tier data, including being honest about which coins have it and which ones don't, instead of just making up a clean number for every single coin to keep a video tidy, is useful to you, go ahead and hit like on this one. It genuinely helps put this kind of honest breakdown in front of more people instead of content that fakes precision it doesn't actually have. Subscribe if you want more of this. The real data, including the honest gaps in it, instead of manufactured certainty dressed up as research. Drop a comment and tell me where you actually landed when you checked your wallet against these tiers. And tell me honestly, which of these three coins surprised you most? The steepness of XRP's curve, the single mega wallet sitting at the top of XLM, or just how undocumented HBAR's percentile structure turned out to be. And if you know somebody who's been repeating a suspiciously precise top 1% number for HBAR specifically without ever checking where that number actually came from, send them this video so they know which of these three numbers to actually trust. Have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. It really helps the channel grow. This is XRP Hulbert signing off. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next one.